So I want to welcome everyone to the Aurora Defence and Space webinar. I'm Dr. Sarah Cannard. I'm the Industry Director here at SmartSat CRC. And we have Peter Kerr, who will be providing this webinar on the current state of defence in Australia as related to the space sector. I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the lands and waters across Australia and the world where we conduct our business, and pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging. Like I've said, just make sure that we're all on mute and got our cameras turned off whilst Peter's presenting so we can have the full floor. Now, the purpose of this Aurora SmartSat CRC webinar is to provide an overview of defence. And there's been a lot of movement in defence over the last few months, half a year or so, with the Defence Strategic Review and the Defence Accelerator and other elements happening. So Peter will provide a great overview there for everyone. So after Peter's presentation, we'll follow that by Q&A. So just hold off on your questions. Feel free to type them into the chat, but we'll address them at the end of Peter's presentation. Once we finish the Q&A, we have a couple of our Aurora members who have been selected to provide a very brief 5-minute overview on their company, just to help ensure that we're maintaining this networking and relationship building. So looking forward to that towards the end of the webinar as well. Now, we are recording this webinar and it will be made available to everyone on the SmartSat CRC YouTube site. So without further delay, I'd like to welcome Peter to share his camera and kick off the webinar for us. Thanks, Peter.
Thanks, Sarah. So good afternoon, everyone. Sarah's asked me to come along today and just speak to, I guess, Aurora on, I guess, my views, my thoughts on. Sorry, I just got to share my screen first. On defence, what's happening in defence at the moment is a stack of stuff you should no doubt read about. And sorry, I shouldn't do two things at once. And so anyway, so this is kind of my perspective on what's been happening post DSR, post ASCA, and what it might mean in terms of space. The presentation I'm about to give is heavily focused on technology and innovation, and I guess that's because I think that's probably what's most interest to startups and the SmartSat community. But I'm happy to sort of delve a bit deeper into some of these issues in the Q&A if there are specific questions people have. And I know many of you have dealt with defence, so again, it'd be interesting to have a conversation at the end about your experience and I guess my views on this. And largely I've drawn upon my background. So I have been with SmartSat CRC full-time since late 2019. But prior to that, I was with the Defence Science and Technology Group and spent over 34 years working in defence science and technology. And that actually included a stint working inside Strategic Policy and Intelligence Group as the Innovation Hub and the Next Gen Tech Fund were being established. So I'll provide some perspectives on that journey as well. Just go to full screen. Hopefully everyone can see those slides now. So pretty much,
yes, thanks, Peter.
I thought it'd be useful just to provide a very brief historical perspective going back to the 2016 white paper, which actually came out with the first integrated investment program, which is where the money goes into capability, but also the Defence Industry Policy Statement. And I think this is a set a foundation for where we are today. And then after that, and I have got some slides in here on the Defence Space Strategy as well, which is kind of the link between that historical work and the Defence Strategic Review and the formation of the Advanced Strategic Capabilities Accelerator. I'll then sort of talk a little bit about what's happening next year and beyond, because the DSR really only sets the scene for more work to be done. And I'll touch on what that might mean and how when things might sort of become a bit more stable. And then the last slide is just one set of thoughts, observations from my perspective on what are some of the challenges and opportunities in working with defence. And then we can have a conversation about what that will mean in the context of the DSR and ASCA. And so on that note, this is, and again, hopefully it's all legible. Really the the scene was set for the DSR, which was released early this year, or at least the government's response to the Defence Strategic Review back in 2016, when three documents were released early in 2016: the Defence White Paper, the Integrated Investment Program, and the Defence Industry Policy Statement. Most of the work for these documents was actually done in 2014 and 2015, and just like now, there was a change of government, which actually meant they were delayed because all of these documents on this chart are not actual departmental documents. These are government documents. So the government of the day, really, they're the ones that own the white papers, the Integrated Investment Program, and Defence implements them on behalf of the government. So there may well be Defence people involved in creating these documents, but in essence, the Minister of the day and Cabinet are the ones that sign them off. So they are very much government documents, and they do always have a political agenda behind them. So in 2016, it was really the underlying kind of mood in Cabinet was around industry policy and how the Liberal Party of the time could actually recover from a number of things that had taken place in the lead up to this, such as the decline of the car industry, a lot of challenges in the manufacturing base. And so Christopher Pyne, who had come in as the Defence Industry Minister, and for the first time that was a cabinet level position, really was quite serious about the $250 billion forward funding commitments to be used almost as an industry policy, industry development type activity. And so that's why the Centre for Defence Industry Capability, the Innovation Hub, and the NGTF were all established. And then sometime later, the Defence Industry Capability Plan was released. It was very much part of this kind of political agenda, which also coincided with Malcolm Turnbull's innovation agenda, the National Innovation Science Agenda. That was all kind of in the mix at the time these things were being framed. In 2020, instead of releasing a new white paper, they actually released what they called a strategic update. So in essence, the 2020 Defence Strategic Update was a white paper. It wasn't called that. And the Force Structure Plan was really just a refresh of the Integrated Investment Program. And there were some significant changes I touch on. But again, these were the sort of most recent documents, which were the foundation for the Defence Strategic Review, which the Albanese government established when it won power in 2022. Importantly, there is actually a new defence industry strategy, which is supposed to be released this month, which will actually be quite instructive in terms of how defence industry policy may adapt. And the DSR talks about the need for this national defence strategy, which will be a white paper and an update to the Integrated Investment Program next year. So the DSR gives us the kind of foundations, but doesn't tell us the details about what government will do moving forward about defence capability programs. And I've got the ASCA on this chart as well. So the industry policy statement really was important because it recognised the defence industry as a fundamental input to capability. It kind of said, really, we can't operate, armoured vehicles and aircraft and, significant defence capability without the industry that deliver those capabilities. And it kind of really reset the relationship between the Department of Defence and industry. And it introduced this concept of sovereign industrial capabilities and said that, really we need to have a better understanding about what capabilities in industry are critical to our security and actually start making sure that we actually sustain them in a way which meets our national security needs. And finally, it also reformed the defence innovation system. Prior to 2016, over decades, there had grown to be about 35 separate funding lines for innovation programs, which included the largest one probably was a Capability Technology Demonstrator Program, the CTD program. And there's things like an F-35, offset program and a whole stack of stuff. And these have been developed over decades, different strategies, different priorities, different approval processes. Some were ad hoc, some were ongoing like the CTDs. But in essence, the DIPS said we need to actually reform innovation and we actually need to sort of have a much more strategic view of how we support industry in developing technology. And so the Innovation Hub was set up and its initial focus was very much on small to medium-sized enterprises and how we actually encouraged companies into the defence supply chain that maybe hadn't historically worked with defence. That was a real push. And equally, we had the Next Generation Technologies Fund, which is where the money for SmartSat from defence came from. And that had a different view, which was more long-term, higher risk. And the two were supposed to work together to actually drive capability solutions through into acquisition. And I guess that probably was a failing from this whole reformed system, was that never really happened. And that's why ASC has now been established. But I'll say a bit more about that in due course. In terms of the strategic update, again, it was quite an important document because it sort of set up these objectives around shape, deter, respond. And I'll touch on why they're important in the context of the DSR. But it really was framed in the emergence of this strategic competition between China and the USA that was actually happening inside the Asia Pacific region where we actually live. And so it kind of, for the first time, dispensed with this notion of strategic warning time. Prior to this document, Australia always assumed it had 10 years to recognise warnings of military build-up and therefore could respond, had time to respond if we needed to in terms of risks or threats to Australia's defence. The departure from that actually is quite significant. And again, the DSR has kind of amplified this strategic warning time issue and indeed the kind of the emergence of grey zone activities as a risk to Australia's security. The other thing that the DSU did was it kind of moved away from these capability streams into the concept of operating domains and how we actually structure our capability acquisition program along the lines of those domains. But importantly, it was the first time that space was recognised as a operating domain in the same way as maritime, land, air, and information and cyber. And that, again, was quite critical in terms of raising the importance of space capabilities within the balance of overall sort of defence capability development. And there's some words there you can see from a document that sort of talked about the fact the government finally recognised that space was actually a critical enabler, and we needed to provide more certainty in terms of how we actually acquired space capabilities. Even though the total amount of investment was tiny and was the smallest of all of the operating domains. So spurred by that, in 2022, effectively Defence finally released the first Defence Space Strategy, and this was released about the same time as the Defence Space Command was actually established in March 2022. So I think this space strategy was released in April, so very soon after. And after a bit of deliberations, they decided that the Defence Space Command would be hosted within the Air Force, but it was a true joint command. And whilst the head was initially a Air Force officer, there were kind of joint service personnel all through it. So the space strategy, kind of identified these 5 lines of efforts that they kind of used to create a foundation for, Defence Space Command as both a capability manager and a space operator. And indeed, an organisation that sets space strategy and space policy. The important thing about it is that it's often read in isolation. And I guess the key point I'd make is that they have this companion document, the Space Power e-manual, was actually released at the same time. And you really have to read both these documents at the same time, because the Space Power manual provides a lot of additional context around how the Defence Department will utilise space as a operating domain, and includes the notions of space power and what that means in terms of us, workforce, national levers of power and capability. So the space strategy itself, again, it actually came out about the same time as the UK similar document. The UK one was much more specific. I found this to be a little bit high level, a bit wishy-washy, and it sort of said all the right things, but not without a lot of granularity in terms of what are the priorities, what are the pressing needs, what are the challenges. It sort of touched on some of these issues, but not in any way that you could actually use it to sort of determine where you might want to invest your research dollars if you're looking to build capability. Importantly, it does kind of very much draw on this whole notion of civil and military, and that was quite a shift as well, because when the Space Agency was established in 2019, it was given a specific remit to look at civilian space. And in fact, the Space Agency's counterpart document, the Australian Civil Space Strategy, did not really talk about defence at all, whereas the Defence Space Strategy does talk about civil and military. And you see this language all through this document. And indeed, it was kind of a foundational document for what was planned to be the space strategic update within the agency, which would actually refresh the civil space strategy and align it with the defence space strategy. But that has not happened, and it's probably unlikely to happen. So in terms of these 5 lines of effort, within each one, there are a series of objectives, and they're the ones where the detail is. And again, it probably still is a bit sort of abstract and high level in terms of, reading through this and trying to understand what it might mean in terms of defence needs. But that's one of the problems with these documents. They do tend to be a little bit sort of waffly and you have to use a lot of sort of domain knowledge to interpret what they actually mean. Importantly, it does talk about these 3 time epochs. And it's interesting because those are a little bit different to what came out on the DSR. But in essence, it talks about this foundation period, which is between when this document was released and sort of about now, an evolved period when they're going to basically start moving as a capability manager towards the future architecture, and then finally a future sort of domain where they kind of really bed down space as an operating domain and space command as a capability manager and an operator. Don't have time to go through all of these things, but as I said, the objectives are quite key in terms of what defence might intend to do, even though they're not very specific. So moving on now to the strategic review, and as I said, pretty much I have been through and looked at whether there's anything in here that might sort of negate elements of a defence space strategy, and I think they are pretty consistent. So the space strategy probably still is because it is pretty high level, still is actually quite meaningful in the context of the direction the DSR will take defence and the government. But some of the key outcomes or changes that sort of came out of this review, and it should also state this was actually one of the first times the government actually looked outside the department for the people that actually led this review. It's a bit like the Commission of Audit in 2015 that led to the defence reform agenda. But Stephen Smith, a former defence minister, and Angus Houston, a former chief of Defence Force, were actually asked to basically do this review, and they did it independently of the department. There were departmental staff involved, but again, it was a review established by the government, for the government, and indeed the public document that has been released, the unclassified document, is actually officially the government's response to the strategic review. It is not the review itself. But in essence, the document, which took place over only a few months, kind of confirmed the government's concerns that the strategic environment has deteriorated since 2020, and that actually does require a complete rethink of how we actually structure the Department of Defence and how we structure the Australian Defence Force in terms of capabilities, bases, so force posture, and future capability acquisitions, including this whole notion of how we're going to incorporate nuclear submarines as part of our maritime deterrent. And that's going to be quite a challenge in itself. But it actually introduces this notion of national defence for the first time, where, in essence, to provide national security, we do need to basically have a strong military, but we also need to reinvigorate diplomatic efforts and look to industry and exports and a whole range of sort of whole of nation approach to delivering security. The shape, deter, respond from the Defence Strategic Update becomes, and it is quite funny if you're not familiar with defence, this strategy of denial. And this is in the context of defence kind of doctrine, not English language. But in essence, what my interpretation is the implication that to deny an adversary actually requires greater military power than deter. And this document does go in great length about that. It actually does make the statement that major power competition, and that is China and the USA, has the potential to threaten our interests, and there is for the first time a real danger of potential conflict, which would have massive implications for our economy and our security. And so this strategy of denial is actually built at deterring aggression and trying to prevent war breaking out. That's the whole goal of this strategic review, is how do we prevent war in our region from breaking out. It kind of reaffirms what the 2020 update said, which is the whole Defence Australia, which is our sea air gap, provides protection in terms of our national security. So this whole doctrine of Defence of Australia, which is we sit back behind the maritime and the air approaches and don't have to worry too much about risk, it no longer occurs. So in essence, it sort of says, more countries are able to project combat power across greater ranges in all 5 domains, and that includes space and cyber. But in essence, this is what the strategic review says is, long-range weapons, cyber attacks, these are all geography independent. So we can no longer rely on geography or warning time to defend ourselves. And importantly, emerging and disruptive technologies, like quantum computers, hypersonics, and a few others are being rapidly translated into military capability, and that changes the whole risk calculus as well. It goes on to say, if we are going to be able to provide this strategy of denial, we need to be able to gain asymmetric advantage in some critical areas of technology. And to do that, we have to have a national science and technology system that actually can develop and deliver disruptive capabilities through technology. And so, really says a lot about the need to increase the speed and pace of delivery. And that's important in terms of, again, the whole capability piece and innovation. It actually is quite scathing of how acquisition currently works within defence. And again, with Chris Deeble coming on board as the Deputy Secretary for CASG, I think he's got a big task to deliver what the DSR says we need around how we acquire capability. And importantly, it introduces this concept of a minimum viable capability. It's critical that in the past we often sort of scope major platforms as being gold-plated, and that actually leads to cost blowouts and delays, and then in the end sort of reduce capability. It's saying we need to be much more iterative in terms of how we acquire capability, and we should start with the minimum requirement and then add to that instead of trying to acquire the perfect capability in one big bang. It recognises that technology has a foundational impact on the character of warfare, and is going to basically shape this balance of power in our regions. So it really is quite an important document in terms of how we have to rethink the whole way we develop and deliver technology, both in Australia and with our allies and partners. But in essence, the commitment to establish this Advanced Strategic Capabilities Accelerator, the ASCA, is really foundational in terms of this whole piece around technology and the need to pull disruptive technologies through into capability more quickly. Importantly, as ASCA must work with industry. So ASCA is not a departmental review. The department will basically coordinate it, but in essence, it sees industry as being a critical partner in this requirement to develop more innovative asymmetric capabilities to address the sort of rapidly emerging threats to our national security. So in terms of what does it say about space, the answer is it doesn't say a lot. There's a one-page summary on space, but there's only 1.5 page on air, about the same on maritime. So pretty much when they do go into sort of the operating domains and what are the challenges and opportunities, it doesn't say a lot. But there are some quite important recommendations which have largely been adopted by government, including moving Defence Space Command from the Air Force into Joint Capabilities Group. And it says they need to do this to maximise its effectiveness. It actually says that Space Command must become a capability manager, and actually it needs to have the authorities to basically define and acquire future space capabilities. And I think there's a really important part to this where they talk about the need for additional investment to support smaller rapid acquisition projects. And I think this is a real opportunity for Australian industry to work in partnership with Space Command and the other end users of space to really drive some innovative technologies through these smaller projects. And that could be an opportunity to even scale up business. So for Aurora members, I think this is one that requires watch this space. It really could be quite exciting as an alternate funding line to the ASCA. On the balance, or the opposite of that, is it does talk about defence needing to consider the level of sovereign capability needs. It clearly articulates that sometimes we actually pursue sovereign capabilities and that costs us in the long term, and that sometimes it'll be cheaper to do it through partnership with commercial providers or allied militaries. And the DSR does kind of make the point that defence needs to be much smarter about when it does develop something nationally. Are there valid reasons for doing that, and what are the opportunity costs of doing that internal development? So moving on to ASCA, because I think ASCA is going to be quite critical in terms of addressing the problems that were established when the original innovation system was reformed in 2016. The whole goal of the Innovation Hub and the NGTF was to form this seamless enterprise for supporting innovation and pulling it through into acquisition. And arguably that has not happened. Very few projects through the Innovation Hub have actually made it into acquisition. There have been some, but they're the exception, not the rule. And even less have sort of made it from the NGTF through into the Innovation Hub and then through into acquisition. So we sort of had this design for a integrated system, which never really sort of saw the light of day. And part of the problem is just this notion of CASG wanting to basically compete through the marketplace through sort of request for tender process, even though they had funded and developed an Australian solution which met needs and actually was, you know, a known entity in terms of risk and cost. They would still want to test that in the marketplace, and that caused all sorts of problems. So ASCA, my interpretation is being established to try and address that problem, which is how do we actually more rapidly support innovation and then pull it through into acquisition should its utility be proven and the defence need continue to be existing. And so that's really the reason for being, is to accelerate this capability development. And they kind of took this mission-based approach. Innovation must translate into acquisition. That's the kind of language used by DSTG and government. And in terms of these missions, which are going to be the major sort of funding lines for ASCA, not the only funding line, but the major one, they have publicly said that they sort of see these as having 3-year durations, and they will actually only support a mission if the capability that it develops has a pathway through to acquisition. So you need to have someone in the capability area and someone in the acquisition organisation that are prepared to work within the mission to ensure that it actually does transition as quickly as possible into programs. They have not talked about the funding scope, but there have been sort of public statements about the number of missions, the duration of the missions, and the total funding envelope for ASCA. And so I anticipate that means missions will be in the sort of magnitude of $10 to $30 million, maybe slightly larger, and look something like what the development of the Ghost Shark or the Ghost Bat capabilities, which we've seen a lot of in recent times. So that's actually a significant improvement over what the Innovation Hub, the largest contract the Innovation Hub ever supported, was probably in the $6 to $7 million category. Yeah, certainly less than 10 million. And even if you look at funding 2 phases or more, you know, it was nowhere near this level of magnitude. And so that was one of the barriers in the Innovation Hub, was if you had a successful technology, how you scaled it up to the point where you could actually have a defence acquisition program, pull it through, was really problematic. So that was one of the reasons I think the hub has failed in terms of pulling through technology into capability. Yeah, the budget of ASCA is quite significant, but when you look at the existing commitments they had made to the Innovation Hub and NGTF, which had now been absorbed into ASCA, is only a modest increase. It is an increase, but it's a modest increase. And yeah, $340 million a year over 10 years sounds a lot, but it's not that much when you're looking at wanting to do 3 or 4 things of significance every year. So it's going to be a challenge. You know, there's going to be, you know, only limited opportunities through ASCA to actually get technology funded. And so I think there is going to be a need to go back into project land where most of the money is, if you are looking at doing technology development. And so that's something that needs to be understood as well in terms of how the national strategic document is going to map out. I said missions are the main funding line for ASCA. It does talk about 2 other alternative approaches: innovation challenges and the RFI that they released a few weeks ago in the area of small UAS. Really is the first of these innovation challenges. And these are very much about, you know, how do we reuse existing technology? So these are not technology development funding lines. This is very much, if we have something that's been developed for another purpose, can we bring it into defence with a small amount of funding to adapt it for defence use? That's what the innovation challenges are. And they have this program called Emerging and Disruptive Technology, which is a bit like NGTF, but it's a small amount of funding, and it's really about seeding new innovation. And they have stated publicly that both these other funding lines could well develop solutions that come into missions, or maybe even used to create missions. But pretty much missions are the main game for ASCA. And as I said, we have yet to see what the first mission is going to look like and how they're going to develop and sort of deliver these. So there's very much watch this space. So in terms of 2024 and beyond, as I said, you know, the DSR does provide the ammunition for a complete shift in focus for defence, but it kicks the can down the road a bit in terms of exact policy. So the new white paper that the DSR recommends will be released sort of no later than the middle of next year. And these will be the ones that will actually define where the project money is going to go, how they're going to fund the submarines, and what are the challenges Defence will have to manage in terms of delivering on the challenges the DSR talks about. And so really we don't know a lot more about where defence funding is going to be until these documents come out next year. And similarly, ASC is unlikely to initiate any of these mission level programs until there's a bit more clarity on the sort of the capability funding envelopes that the IOP will actually produce. And so they may know that internally, so you may see they'll be preparing for that. But I don't anticipate seeing any requests for inputs into any mission for ASCA until probably mid next year at the earliest. The DSR does talk about these 3 epochs of time. So 23-25 is very much about how we make changes to the existing funding lines to start moving towards the integrated force. 2026 to 2030 is really when there's going to be this kind of shift of major funding lines. But 2031 and beyond is when you're going to start to see really acceleration of this changed portfolio of capabilities that the DSR says we need to actually introduce. So we have got probably 5 years to position technology development to really drive into capability outcomes in 2031 and beyond. So in terms of, this is my last slide, and it's just, again, a kind of collection of thoughts, observations in terms of what are the challenges and opportunities working with Defence. And it is worth stating, if you have not worked with Defence, they are a difficult customer. It can take a long time to get into contract, and bidding for major projects in particular can be very expensive. And if you look at JP 9102, 5 consortiums formed to bid for that $3 billion project, and each one of those would have spent tens of millions of dollars in actually putting the bid together, forming the teams, and then waiting for Defence to decide on what they're going to do. So, probably industry spent collectively $50 million bidding for that $3 billion project. And so that's a challenge for a small organisation. But importantly, 9102 did actually have this idea of industry teams. And so there's opportunities to get involved with the major primes in the supply chain for these big projects. There is intense competition, and this includes very well-connected global corporations that have whole units of people that are designed to sort of wine and dine decision makers and get some sort of advantage if they can in terms of how they basically position their kind of brand for these opportunities. And the contract terms and the management process can be overwhelming if you haven't done it before. CASG and even sort of the smaller organisations like the Innovation Hub, which did contract management, used a very kind of complex response to the defence procurement rules, which can be quite overwhelming if you don't have familiarity. And organisations like ODIS, the Office of Defence Industry Support, have a lot of programs that can actually help support small companies, growing companies, for positioning themselves and preparing themselves to work with Defence. And there are a lot of support available to position, to get across some of these complexities. Requirements for projects are often unclear and can change through a project, so you've got to be adaptable. And indeed, when you do deliver the equipment, it actually has to operate in very complex and dangerous environments, so it has to succeed. So, the actual resilience for delivered capability is extreme in terms of it. So, bottom line is there is big budgets in Defence, but they're there for a reason, because it is a challenging environment to operate in. People often overlook sustainment as a source of funding. CASG is acquisition and sustainment, and they spend as much money on sustaining capabilities as acquiring them. And so, there's opportunities in training, maintenance, and upgrading of existing capabilities, which are often overlooked as potentially ways of getting into Defence funding. And between those first 2 points, people often think Defence has got a lot of money, $50 billion a year, it must be able to afford stuff. But a lot of the money is actually allocated, so there's not a lot of discretionary funding. And if you have got a good idea or a new proposal for some technology development, it can often take 1 or 2 years to find that money if it hasn't already been allocated to a program like ASCA or something else. And so, it's not the cash cow that you think it might be just on the basis of a budget it has. And the other comment I'd make is that when it does come to acquiring entirely new classes of capability, like a gently radar, that's extremely rare. And so there are huge barriers of entry for emerging technology or technology push, but it does happen and it can happen. But again, it's even more challenging than sort of following project requirements. And the final comment I'll make is that the government of the day does intervene because your bureaucracy can sometimes actually be quite a barrier to getting stuff done. If you have got a local member or you have got contacts politically, don't be afraid to use them, but do it with caution, because sometimes when governments do get involved, it kind of leads to unpredictable outcomes. So, sometimes you don't want to do that, but don't assume that the bureaucracy will treat everyone fairly. Sometimes a bit of push through the political sphere can actually make quite a difference in terms of getting good outcomes. And there have been many cases historically where companies have actually used the politicians to get an outcome which benefits Australian industry. So it's quite an important tool in your back pocket if you need to use that. And so on that note, that's pretty much all I had to say. Happy to take any questions or receive any feedback.
Brilliant. Thanks, Peter. We will open up for questions from the floor. I've got a couple here that I am happy to ask, unless someone else would like to post something. All right, I'll jump in and warm up the crowd, so to speak. So Peter, and these are, I'm going to throw you under the bus. These are not rehearsed questions, so apologies in advance, Peter. So given the uncertainty with ASCA, we know it's new and it's finding its feet, but not knowing how they're going to go about asking for expressions of interest, tenders, the missions, the priorities, etc. How would, or what advice would you give to our members to prepare for this when these ASCA missions are announced, if they wanted to get into the defence sector?
Again, I think it's a hard question to answer, Sarah. I mean, we have the same debate in SmartSat as well. I mean, I think you do need to utilise, defence does go out to industry quite a lot. Those industry policy statements from 2016 onwards, they set up a whole range of industry engagement type mechanisms, including ODIS, the Office of Defence Industry Support, which actually provide access for smaller companies to defence to get a feel for what's going on and where there might be opportunities. My feeling right now is ASCA is going to define missions in sort of, undersea warfare type concepts. So it's not going to be, I want to buy a bit of technology. I need to develop a capability that does certain things. And that capability will require technologies from across, platforms, information systems, communications, sensing. It'll require a large number of technologies. So when missions do start forming for ASCA, my feeling is they're going to be quite large and that you're going to be involved in a team. And so the question is, how do you actually position yourselves to respond when those requests come in? I think use the environmental working groups, use ODIS. If there are webinars from ASCA, turn up and listen in. These are all what I'd suggest as ways to sort of keep your ear to the ground to when these opportunities come along. ASCA will be supporting 3 missions a year. And so, it may be possible to get involved in one or more of those. And if the first mission doesn't align to your technology or where your business is going, there'll be more to come. So it will be different to the Innovation Hub, though. The Innovation Hub had a subscription model. You could put in an unsolicited proposal. I think ASCA is going to walk away from that. It's going to be much more outcomes driven. So defence will say, I need this, and then industry has to basically deliver, based on what they have in their back pocket. So so ASCA is going to be a bit challenging, I think, to start getting your head around how you might engage, particularly as a smaller company. But I think there will be a lot of opportunities if you're agile and nimble enough to get involved in contributing a small bit of technology.
Yeah, thanks, Peter. I've got a couple of questions that have come in on the chat. So one here, so great overview, I agree. Can you comment on the fact that even though we've got these plans in place, the execution of the plans relies on individuals and their points of view? For example, people that think that it's not Defence's job to look after defence space supply chain. Can you comment in summary the difference between what the plan is versus the likely implementation?
It's interesting. I mean, I'd probably take a different view. I think inside Space Command, they do see supply chain as critical. I mean, whilst their decisions they take, partnering with Lockheed Martin, for 9102 and indeed for SBAS as well, government, more broadly government, shows they are kind of more inclined to go for larger multinationals. I think there is a genuine understanding that if we don't, defence doesn't know what's under the hood, so to speak, you can't really get the most out of a capability. And so having Australian citizens and Australian companies that are delivering the solution gives defence a lot more leverage in terms of how they use a capability. So I think they do recognise that some of the components in a major capability, even if a big satellite's being built in the US, how you use that satellite requires technology which could be built in Australia, and they are very keen to maximise that supply chain for those technologies where there's a good advantage or answer for having that. So I think it may seem like defence is kind of focused on the big picture and doesn't really care, but I do believe Space Command has got a real interest in workforce, and that includes workforce across the space capability development area. And so they see it as one of the major challenges for defence is how we get enough people that understand space to contribute to capability outcomes. But having said that, they're not going to basically spoon feed industry. They're not going to basically subsidize industry. Industry's got to be able to compete, and it's got to show that it's actually got technology which is competitive, and that they can be delivered without defence having to sort of take too much oversight on it. But Space Command has actually let contracts with Gilmore, they've let contracts with Fleet Space. They have shown in recent years an ability to sort of support growing Australian companies. So I think there'll be more of that to come in the future, which is why I think that funding line for rapid innovation acquisitions is really an important opportunity for particularly SMEs in Australia.
Yeah, brilliant. Thanks, Peter. So the next question on the line is there a need for SMEs, and I'm assuming that's small to medium enterprise and not subject matter experts, so correct me if I'm wrong, Adam, is there a need for SMEs to be able to deliver on the entirety of a mission in order to secure ASCA funding, or can SMEs deliver part of the mission for an upstream integrator, so the prime essentially?
Yeah, thanks, Adam. And I kind of tried to touch on this already. A lot of this is my speculation, so please don't read anything into this, because I don't speak for defence, and I certainly don't speak for ASCA, and we don't know how ASCA is going to go about this. But as I said a minute ago, my feeling is ASCA will define problems like, how do we do space control in Australia? Space control has got a space domain awareness, putting it back to the LEO labs kind of context. And so if you have a commercial product which can provide data, absolutely, I think there could be an interest from ASCA in actually having that provided as an input into an ASCA mission. And indeed, where ASCA would be particularly interested is if you actually had a capability you had developed for a non-defence application, and you could modify or adapt it so it's even more attuned to defence needs, that's where they would probably get interested in funding that sort of activity within an ASCA mission. So my feeling is there will absolutely be needs, opportunities for SMEs to become part of a team which delivers, elements of a capability solution through technology developed, within that company.
Yeah, brilliant. Thanks, Peter. All right, what we might do is now move on to the next element of the presentation, and we've had some responses from a number of people wanting to present, give a 5-minute overview of their organisation. So we selected 3 of those that we think were most relevant to defence. So what I'll do is I'll open the floor in this order, assuming they're online, and I can't see everyone because of my screen, but that's fine. We've got Daniel from Cyber Ops, if you'd like to go first, followed by Anne Bettens from Deneb Space, and then Shagun from Spiral Blue. So what I'll do is I'll hand over the floor to yourselves. I'll turn off my camera, but I'll come back on as a proxy to a 1-minute warning for your 5 minutes. So hopefully that'll be subtle enough. Over to you, Daniel, you've got the floor.
Hi, I presume I'm sharing. So hi,
yes,
it's Daniel here from CyberOps, and thanks, Peter. It was a great talk. CyberOps does, we've been going since 2016. We're a member of Aurora, and we've had a SmartSat CRC contract as well to do space cyber. We operate in 3 streams. The first one is standard cybersecurity, which we also operate in space domain awareness. We have a passive RF sensor network, and we kind of specialize in space cyber. So we'll talk about those 3 areas very quickly. So when it comes to standard cybersecurity, from a defence and space perspective, I'll just focus on those things quickly. We're upgrading the second largest secret network in the country, and that comes down to what Peter was saying. It's under the CASG part, the support part. We also do the cyber reviews for all the launch underneath the ASA. And we've had contracts doing cyber for space domain awareness as well, to help SPOs in the acquisition part above the line in that area. We've just done the critical infrastructure part, which is kind of related to space in a way. We've just finished taking off an Accenture hat, reviewing the underlying network for the entire air traffic network system for the country. So we do high level, big picture cybersecurity and engineering review. When it comes to the two spacey kind of projects, Space IQ, we developed, probably started talking to the Wide Area Space group in 2018, so it's been quite a while. And this is just our pilot that we built ages ago. And we collect data, we're connected to global databases, and we've been working in Space Fest and working with WASPO and Space Command doing space domain awareness work. And back in, again, goes to Peter's reference to the DIH. 2018, we put a proposal into DIH, and in 2019, 2019, we were awarded it. And in 2020, we delivered a space cyber framework and an architecture. And then it kind of went to sleep for a while. And I like to tell people 3 defence ministers got involved. And then after 2.5 years, the current phase has been enabled, and that's to build a space cyber testing facility, training environment, some training material, and updating the architecture and the cyber security framework. That project kicked off in the middle of this year. So that's underway, and I believe it's the last DIH project in the country. There may be one more that comes out after, but I believe that was the last one. So I can talk to that if required, the dramas of dealing with DIH, but it's moved to a new format now. So the most important thing of my quick chat is to mention that we've got a Space Cyber Forum, and CRC is actually a sponsor of this. So it's not on the picture there, but they are. And it's the 10th of October in the Convention Centre. So encouraging anyone who's interested in space cyber. And we've got people from Europe and America coming over. And the concept is there's a good growing space cyber community in France or Europe. There's one definitely growing in America, and we'd like to try and build some community here. And this is an output actually of a SmartSat CRC project that Flinders University and CyberOps did around space cyber governance and policy. And one of the recommendations was to build a community, and I suppose we just did it. And that's what we're talking about here. So very keen for people who are interested to join and come along in October. That's my very quick 5 minutes talk, and I can ask questions if required.
Brilliant, thanks, Daniel. Yep, certainly got time for one question. If anybody has anything they'd like to throw Daniel's way. No, all right. Brilliant. Thanks for that, Daniel. Very much appreciate it. All right, so we'll hand over to Anne if you're up. There she is. Brilliant. Thanks, Anne. Over to you. If you're talking, Anne, we can't. Oh, there we go.
So unmute, what a rookie mistake. Hello, I'm Anne from Deneb Space, and our mission at Deneb Space is to revolutionize satellite maneuvering in space, and particularly looking at sort of rendezvous and close proximity operations. And we hope to make satellites more agile to enable space missions and make sure that they're successful. So currently, one of our minimum viable products that we've got flying early next year is a very high torque actuator, which is obviously very, very useful for that mobility and maneuvering in space. And it also requires a very low amount of power. So also once again, a pretty useful capability that we've got there. So currently we're working on building optical sensors for vision-based navigation, incorporating some artificial intelligence into that for that close proximity relative obligation as well. And additionally, it's an alternative for position, navigation and timing, which, linking back to kind of, I guess, the defence context there, that's also pretty useful if you're not reliant on a GPS or a GNSS alternative there. So some pretty exciting things in the pipeline there. And the reason that we're kind of working on these modular things is that we're hoping to develop a hardware enabled software stack, basically. So having sort of this plug and play modular aspect where we can have this hardware and software components working together to be able to create an attitude, determination and control solution essentially for maneuvering in space. And that's got some pretty useful applications, once again, in this defence context of asset inspection, debris removal, lifetime extension. As I mentioned, that GPS alternative as well. It's really useful for those kinds of things. So really fitting quite nicely into that space situational awareness and space domain awareness category as well. And then hopefully for some additional use, we've got some kind of cool robotic applications and some other navigation projects in the pipeline as well. But that's kind of a bit of an overview of what we did. So kept it nice and short and sweet. So yeah, if you've got any questions or if you'd be interested in reaching out, please just let me know.
Brilliant. Thanks, Anne. Any questions for Anne while you've got her available to answer them? And your screen's black as well, Anne, if you're sharing your camera.
Oh, thank you.
Oh, is that a question? No, must be some feedback. Okay. All right. Lucky last. I'll hand over to Spiral Blue for Shagun to give their presentation if they're online.
Hi, excuse me. Yes, I am online. Thank you very much for this webinar. It was very interesting. Hi, everyone. I'm Shagun Sachdeva. I'm the Head of Business Development and Strategy at Spiral Blue. Spiral Blue is a startup. Well, we were formed in 2018, so a scale-up basically, that develops artificial intelligence and machine learning applications, as well as edge computing or onboard processing solutions. As I said, we were founded in 2018, and our main purpose mission was to make the satellite data more accessible. And we started off by wanting to run applications on satellites in orbit itself. But soon we realized that there wasn't enough hardware capabilities on satellites. So we kind of dived into that, and we have now developed Edge Computer, which is Space Edge Computer, which is our second generation Space Edge Computer, which is on Earth observation satellite called Satellogic constellation. It is currently in orbit at a TRL 8 level, fully commissioned, and we are running customer code on it as well. Space Edge Computer is quite useful in terms of having autonomous decision making on orbit, as well as real-time data retrievation. We have also received in funding 1.3 million from government grants, as well as private investments. Our customers basically vary from commercial to government contracts. Our application that are optimized to run on Space Edge computers include vessel detection, Cloud Clipper, Canopy Mapper, fire severity, and so on. These are just some of the examples that we can run on satellites to using the Satellogic imagery. And interestingly, for this webinar, our first application, Vessel Detect, was actually a defense contract as well. We are a team of 9 people at the moment, with our head offices in Sydney at Cicada Innovations Building. And I think I've covered pretty much everything, keeping it short and sweet as everyone else. If you have any questions, please let me know. I'll be happy to answer any questions that are coming my way. Thank you for your time.
Brilliant. Thanks, Shagun. Are there any questions No. All right. Well, what we might do is wrap up then. So I'd like to thank Peter in particular for presenting today and that overview, and the three Aurora members for their overview as well. So thank you for that. Now, just to wrap up, just as a bit of a spruik to the next webinar, there will be another 2 Aurora webinars between now and the end of the year. The next one is scheduled in for Wednesday, the 15th of November at lunchtime, so 12:30 in SA, and the conversion for what other states you might be in. And the topic of this webinar is about defining and validating your value proposition and business model. So it's a very different sort of topic, and we're doing that on purpose to make sure that we provide a full range of webinar topics for our members. Okay, on that note, a couple of things coming through the chat. Looks like Peter's happy to release the slides. Also, this presentation will be available on the SmartSat CRC YouTube site once it's been released. So on that note, I will release you to have an enjoyable rest of your day, and thanks for tuning in.